Okay, looking at our first objective here with SOL2, we have SOL2A. The student will apply the fundamental political principles of American democracy. Our key terms that we will see repeatedly throughout the year are democracy, consent of the governed, limited government, rule of law, and representative government. Types of government, some things that you have learned from the previous 2 years in your history classes. A dictatorship is a government controlled by one person or a small group of people. Your example last year is Hitler and the Nazi Party. And from sixth grade history, you will remember England in the Revolutionary War, and their system of government is a monarchy in which the government is passed down through a family line. As we do these frames, I want you to make sure you pause the screen and keep it there as long as you need to write these down. Follow along with your frames. And for our first section is our 5 fundamental principles. It is about, there are 5 fundamental political principles that are important to the United States. Pause this screen to write everything down. All right, democracy's foundation began more than 2,500 years ago. Democracy began in ancient Greece, most famously in the city of Athens. Every citizen of Athens had the right and responsibility to participate in the city's government. A direct democracy is when all the citizens can debate and vote on laws. This was how it's done in Athens. Why is this type of government not particular for countries with large populations? And the reason is not everybody can go and talk to the president. For instance, with us, not everyone can go up and talk to Obama. Time everybody has their direct say, his presidency would probably be over. So it's too time consuming. So we elect representatives for us in a representative democracy. The citizens choose representatives to debate and make the laws for them. So who is the source of power in a representative democracy? It's the people. What is the common factor in both the direct democracy and representative? The government is run by the people. Democracy is a government in which the people have the power to rule. Continuing on with your frame, a democracy is a government in which the people hold the power to rule, or simply put, the people rule. Abraham Lincoln called our nation a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Pause the screen if you need to. Make sure you get this down in your frame. Continuing on with our key terms and more explanations, consent of the governed. Consent means your permission, and governed is the people. People give consent through their votes. The American citizens are the source of the government's power. Another key term that's highly important is popular sovereignty. People have the right to rule. Make sure you come back to these frequently to refresh your memory on what consent of the governed is. We will use this term periodically throughout the year. Continuing on with your frame, pause the screen if you need to. Write this down for consent of the governed. Our next key term, limited government. The government is not all powerful. It may only do the things that people have given it the power to do. Power is limited through the separation of powers, our 3 branches of government, and our checks and balances systems. We will learn more about these in greater detail further down the line. Limited government. The government is not all powerful and may only do the things that people have given it the power to do. Think checks and balances. Below you can see the 3 pictures of our legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Pause the screen if you need to. Follow along with your frame. Rule of law. All people, including those who work for the government, are bound by the law. The law is more important than any other person or any one person. No man is above the law, and no man is below it. Continuing with your frame, fill this in for rule of law. Pause the screen if you need to. Okay, coming back to the term representative government. People elect the government leaders to make the laws and run the government for them. Every time we elect a candidate, they become our representative. When representatives are elected, we are given the consent to be governed by those people. Once again, pause the screen if you need to. Fill this information in with your frame. Every frame ends with a so what section. In this part of the so what section, the fundamental principles define and shape the American constitutional government. Pause the screen if you need it. Moving right along into SOL 2B, the student will explore founding documents and their impact on writing the Constitution. The student will be able to explain the key contributions of the following documents: the Charters of Virginia Company, London, Virginia Declaration of Rights, and Virginia Statute for the Religious Freedom. Moving on to our next frame, make sure you have the right one. Make sure it says CE.2B-1. And you're going to fill this in at the top with our key topic being our founding documents. Our American constitutional government is founded on concepts articulated in early documents. Pause the screen if you need to and fill this in with your. The Charters of the Virginia Company of London. In the early 1600s, England was looking to expand its economic dominance over Europe. Companies began to look eastwards towards the New World. In 1606, the Virginia Company of London asked the king for permission to travel to the New World to look for gold. The king issued them a charter or granted permission to set up a colony in the New World. It laid out how the colony was to be ruled. Today, state governments issue charters to establish new cities, counties, and towns, and we will learn about that a little bit later. Continuing on with your frame, the Charters of the Virginia Company in London. It was written by King James I in 1606, established in Jamestown Colony. Colonists can govern themselves but are still subject of the king. All colonists granted the rights of English citizens. Make sure you hit pause if you need to. Fill in your frame. So looking at the charters and our principles that we have just talked about, one of the major principles that was established in the Charters of Virginia Company in London was limited government. The charters established the colony as self-rule, but limited that power by maintaining the colonists were still under the rule of the king. All colonists were granted the same rights as Englishmen. Our next document, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. By 1774, it was becoming apparent that the colonies were going to declare independence from Great Britain. The colonies began drafting constitutions to govern themselves as independent nations. Virginia's first constitution acted as a model for what now our current government would look like. It established a three-branch government and was the first to include a list of citizens' rights. Eventually, it would become a model for the Bill of Rights, which was our first 10 amendments. All right, follow along with here on your frame. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, written by George Mason in 1776, lists the individual rights that Virginians should have. It served as a model for the Bill of Rights and used in the first Virginia Constitution. Pause the screen if you need to. Complete your frame. Make sure you become familiar with this slide here. The Declaration of Rights, our key principles represented in it is limited government, representative government, democracy, and consent of the governed. Make sure you read over this screen. Hit pause if you need to. Our Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. In 1786, Jefferson wrote a Virginia law calling for the complete separation of church and state in Virginia. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom calls for a complete freedom of religion in Virginia. It served as the model for the First Amendment. Take a moment to pause the screen and read over. Okay, continuing on with your frame, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. Law written by Thomas Jefferson in 1786. Stated freedom of religious beliefs and opinions, provided a separation of church and state. It also was a law that provided the freedom to worship. Pause the screen if you need to. Fill in your frame. So our key principle in the Statute for Religious Freedom is limited government. No government, religion, citizens free to worship or not to worship, and separation of church and state. Continuing on with 2B, we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence, and you will explore the founding documents and their impact right in the Constitution, and carrying on with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, you all learned about a couple years ago in 6th grade history. In the early 1770s, King George III levied various heavy taxes against the colonists in order to help pay for the money lost during the British involvement in the French and Indian War. Some of these examples are the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, and the Sugar Act. Due to the fact that the colonists were not represented in Parliament, which is the British legislature, the colonists felt this to be unfair. In 1606, King James granted the colonists the same rights as English citizens. The battle cry of the colonists became no taxation without representation. As a protest to the Tea Act, Boston colonists led to the Boston Tea Party. You're all familiar with this from a couple years ago where the colonists dressed up like Indians, raided a tea ship, and threw the tea into the Boston harbor. This, of course, was going to anger King George. He sends British army to the colony to restore the order, and then we had the Quartering Act, which said that the colonists had to house the soldiers. All these issues would end up leading to the Boston Massacre, where some citizens ended up throwing some rocks, some ice at some English troops, and they fired on the citizens. Okay, make sure you're following along with the frame. CE 2B-2, our Declaration of Independence. New political ideas led to a desire for independence and a democratic government in the American colonies. It was written by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Make sure you pause the screen, write this in on your frame, and read the following 4 bullets. Next on our frame is the main idea. Key philosophies of the Declaration of Independence were based upon ideas first expressed by European philosophers such as John Locke. This is a social contract. Okay, now Locke also wrote that in order to protect these rights, man gives his consent to be ruled by a government, consent of the governed. This is also called a social contract. Government gets to rule as long as it protects a man's unalienable rights. If government abuses this responsibility, it is the responsibility of the people to abolish this government and create a new one. Make sure you pause the screen if you need to. The Declaration of Natural Rights. Jefferson divided the document into 3 main parts. The first, or Declaration of Natural Rights, establishes the idea of unalienable rights and a social contract. It affirms certain unalienable rights such as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it has also established the idea that all people are created equal. Make sure you pause this if you need to. Complete your frame. Pause the screen, take a moment, and read through it. Okay, the Declaration of Independence listed grievances or complaints against the king. So go ahead and pause the screen, fill in your frame, stated grievances against the King of Great Britain. There were several grievances. Pause the screen, read through these, as I'm not going to go through each individual one. Okay, so next up in our frame, the Declaration of Independence. In the final section, Jefferson declared the colonies as an independent, free nation. Jefferson also stated that any refusal to the British to accept any portion of the Declaration would be considered an act of war. So pause the screen, fill in your frame with declared the colonies independence from Great Britain. Go ahead and pause the screen and read through this paragraph on your own. Lastly, in our So What section, the Declaration of Independence proclaimed independence from Great Britain, and it stated that people have natural or inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the idea that all men are created equal. Pause the screen, finish out your frame. Okay, next, the document we're going to look at is the Articles of Confederation. Okay, the Articles of Confederation. By 1777, the Revolutionary War is in full swing. The colonists understood that to stand up to the largest military in the world, they would have to be united. And continuing on with our frame, make sure you have the right one. It should say CE2B-3, the Articles of Confederation. Articles of Confederation was a constitution written during the American Revolution to establish the powers of the new national government. Make sure you pause the screen, fill in your frame. The Articles of Confederation established the first national government of the independent states. It provided for a weak central government because we did not want another king. So go ahead and make sure you pause the screen, fill in your frame. The states had all the powers in the Articles of Confederation. The central government primarily served to sponsor a military. Congress had no power to tax, regulate business or currency, and this would prove fatal to the new nation. So go ahead and pause the screen, fill in your frame with gave Congress no power to tax or regulate commerce among the states, and provided for no common currency. To finish the Articles of Confederation up, after the conclusion of the war, the weaknesses of the Articles led to economic and social collapse of the new nation. As a result, a constitutional convention was called to see if the Articles can be repaired. Lastly, in our So What section, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation led to an effort to draft a new constitution. The main political principle in the Articles of Confederation is limited government. Weak central government, no power to tax, no power to enforce laws, no power to regulate commerce, and that's on there twice. So now that we have seen that the Articles of Confederation did not work, a new constitution was needed, and so this section of 2B, we're going to look at our United States Constitution. The United States Constitution. By early 1787, it had become apparent that the government under the Articles of Confederation, or the AOC, had failed, and the national government needed to be stronger. Congress authorized a convention to be held to revise the AOC, but the document was primarily written by James Madison. So fill in your frame. Make sure it says CE2B-4, the United States Constitution. And the key topic there is weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation led to the effort to draft a new constitution. The U.S. Constitution. On May 25, 1787, 55 delegates from 12 out of 13 colonies met. Rhode Island was not present. The purpose of the government should be to protect basic rights and promote the common welfare. A strong national government would be the only way to achieve this. The Articles of Confederation simply said a league of friendship between 13 independent states. Imagine 13 children living together in a house with no parents. Pretty chaotic. American political thought was very against the idea of one single leader or a central government. It was too much like the British government. So the Founding Fathers drew on the governments of ancient Greece, which is a democracy, in Rome, which was a republic. They decided that the new government would have a strong national government that shared power with the states. Ultimately, all power would come from the people, and this became known as the Great Experiment in Democracy. You can take a minute and pause the screen and make sure you become familiar with our three branches of government and their powers. We will get into this later on in more detail. So unlike the Articles of Confederation, which called for one branch of government, the new government would be separated into three branches, the executive, legislative, and judicial, in order to prevent power from being abused. This would be called our separation of powers. So take a moment, pause the screen, and complete your frame with establish the structure of the U.S. government. In addition to lawmaking power being separated into three branches, power would be shared by the federal, state, and local governments. This concept is known as federalism. It is very important for you to understand. Federalism is the division of power between our federal, state, and local governments. In addition to setting up the government, the Constitution established the rights of individuals. All people are equal under the law. The law is more important than the individual, which is rule of law, and the majority opinion rules through the consent of the governed, and the minority views are protected through freedom of speech. So complete your frame, pause the screen if you need to, with granted equality under the law, with majority rule and the rights of the minority protected. The Constitution protects human dignity or the treatment through limitations of governmental power, limited government, due process, and denied powers. The government cannot arrest people without charges. You cannot have a trial by jury or without jury, so you are permitted to have a trial by jury of your peers, and it also permits no cruel and unusual punishment. So complete your frame, pause the screen here with affirmed individual worth and dignity of all people. Next, we have the rights of the people are also protected through the Bill of Rights, which are our first 10 amendments. Our First Amendment guarantees the rights of the people. Go ahead and pause the screen and write down protected the fundamental freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. The last portion of the frame for the U.S. Constitution is our so what. The development of the Constitution the development of the Constitution of the United States was significant to the foundation of the American Republic. The Constitution of the United States of America established a federal system of government based on power being shared between the national and states government. All right, this was the last slide for our lecture on 2A through 2B. Make sure you become familiar with these concepts. This video will be on EDU Canon, which is what you should have already viewed this through, but it will also just be a regular YouTube video up on our website, so you can go back at any time and check it out. Study up.